All right, Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, so you're approaching 10 years of science exchange. And
Yeah.
I think it's been pretty well documented, all the incredible stuff you guys have done. What I really want to talk about is the next 10 years. So, what do you think science looks like in 10 years?
Yeah, it's a super exciting question. And we were just talking about all of the exciting work you're doing, which I think is, really very interesting in terms of the funding side of how science evolves over the next 10 years. I think a lot about science, from a biomedical perspective, because that's my background and, predominantly worked as a cancer biologist in academia and then with science exchange, really in the biomedical pharma industry. So for me, I think about the next 10 years really being driven by this move from what I call artisanal science to industrial science. And that's, I think, already well underway. And it's super interesting because it solves a lot of the problems that I've sort of worked on personally around things like quality, reproducibility, distribution of where experiments are done in terms of the expertise. And I think I'm seeing it happen a lot, and it's super exciting because it's really about how people aren't doing things with their hands. Instead, machines are starting to do a lot of that work and that heavy lifting, and then it's about the scientists really being the ones that design the experiments that are the creative force rather than the hands that just do this routine work. So that to me is like in 10 years time I expect that most experiments will be done by machines, and that will open up a world of we're already seeing that with big data, but like the amount of data that will be generated will be much larger. The analysis of that data will be much more done by machines, and I think it'll be really transformative.
You know, Earlier in the series, I interviewed Paula Stefan, who wrote this book, How Economics Shape Science. Have you ever read it?
I haven't, no.
I highly recommend it. She does, I mean, she's just does a great job sleuthing like where all the money goes and how it incentivizes everybody in the system. And it's interesting because there's a small section of the book that is on tools. It's very, very short. And it talks about how, the NSF figuring out like, well, we can build these big infrastructure projects and then slice them out and have people share them. And that was a really important like breakthrough for 20th century science. And I think tools in general are this important, hugely important aspect of science that are, for the most part, really understudied. There's no like meta science studying like the costs of tools. And I think you guys are at Science Exchange are really pioneering, the sharing of tools on a not CERN level of equipment. Um, can you tell me like what the state of the world is in the tool sharing space, and also where you think that's going to go in the next decade?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I actually think a lot about economics and how, actually, because my co-founder is an economist. So when we started Science Exchange, we always joke that I'm the science and he's the exchange. And really, a lot of the thought behind, when we started Science Exchange was around, for me, what I considered to be a lot of broken incentives, and particularly academic research, but it subsequently kind of evolved to obviously be much more inclusive of the entire sort of ecosystem. But when we was talking about that, we would talk a lot about incentives, and I think that economic component drives all of the sort of ideas and the function of Science Exchange. It was really, how do you take out the weird kind of bargaining that scientists do in order to access the tools they need. A lot of it is just like, who do you know? How can you kind of, barter with each other? And it just struck me as sort of insane. Like, why don't you just have a proper economic system, i.e. people who have stuff that they want to offer for money, list it. People who have money that want to buy it. That's like the simplicity of it, and so that actually kind of was like the central sort of idea of Science Exchange. And I think that to me, I think the world of science is definitely one of those examples of like the rich get richer. If you think about funders, a lot of the time I see these examples where somebody at Harvard, they have access to something like 83 core facilities that have these amazing cutting edge instruments. If you're a researcher at another university and you want to write a grant that relies on using that infrastructure, a lot of the time, grant reviewers will say, well, they don't even have access to that type of instrumentation. It really becomes like a rich get richer scenario where you have a huge advantage because you're at a certain institution and you can access all these cutting edge technologies and therefore generate all this amazing data and therefore get all the next series of grants. Yeah. And so, you think, oh, well, Science Exchange can kind of, completely disrupt that by saying anybody can actually access those 83 core facilities or any of the other 600 core facilities that exist through Science Exchange, and that really levels the playing field for people, and I think that's really exciting. Although I would also say that where Science Exchange has seen the predominant adoption is not academia, it's actually industry. So industry, because again of economic incentives, is much more motivated around speed, value drivers, how they can get their science done and move to the next value inflection point. And so that's where, more than 95% of our usage is biotech and pharma, because they're super focused on, I can work with anybody through Science Exchange, no contracts. So it's basically instant access to this world of service providers. And that's where we've seen the predominant growth.
So you guys are using that industrial engine to drive the company growth, but I also think you're using it to drive real changes in academia. I mean, you think about, maybe you can talk about the reproducibility project and where that's at and where you see that going, because I think that's like, that's actually shaking up the way that some people think about academic research.
Yeah, the reproducibility project was one of those kind of experiments in a lot of ways around, a time period where a long time ago now, actually, when we started the reproducibility project, it was really, this big question of, is the science that's published high quality? Like, can you actually use the fact that it's a Nature paper or a science paper as a marker of quality? And, the feedback, particularly in the biomedical setting, was no, right? Like, pharmaceutical companies actually publicly came out and said, we can't really reproduce any of the research that's published. And so it kind of became a question of, well, what's really the value of that work? And so I think that ties a lot into what I first said around the artisanal nature of a lot of the experiments that were being conducted at that time. And I think as we move through, and we've basically finished the reproducibility project now, it's actually just in the final stages of the meta-analysis publication. But I think that project sort of evolved over the course of conducting it with a series of different initiatives that were unrelated to the reproducibility project, but I think all come at that same question of, how do you ensure the quality of the work that's being produced, because otherwise what's really the point of doing it? And so with the reproducibility project, we took published work and attempted to replicate those experiments, and that was extremely challenging for a variety of reasons. And I think it was more challenging than anybody could have ever imagined. But I think alongside that, we worked with, and I've been talking a lot with the DARPA team that's now funding these independent verification and validation work. So 10% of their funding goes to these teams that actually work alongside the teams they've funded, with the idea being that, you do these initial exploratory experiments, then how do you have a team that really, independently validates that work and those protocols and kind of gets it, ready for prime time, so that it's easy for the next group that wants to take that work and build on it to do so. And that's so much easier because you're working, hand in hand with the team that's doing the work, rather than, for the reproducibility project, it was very backward looking. So of course the postdocs and the students that did the original work had left the lab. There was, it was a time before Dropbox and all of those things were sort of fully standard. There wasn't electronic lab notebooks. It was crazy. Like, going back, you would ask people for data sets, almost none of them had them. It was like pretty difficult to even, really access the underlying data that was in these papers, the protocols, the reagents that were used. I mean, it was a mess.
It's still true in ocean science. I was just talking to coral scientists who are, have the same problem. Like that, it's all these the data is so siloed. It's crazy.
Yeah.
A question I want to ask, I'm so excited to ask you, is you've been this pioneer of breaking this barrier between science and industry, right? You've become like the prototypical scientist turned entrepreneur, and you've done it yourself. You've built the company, but you've become an investor and a mentor to so many others. And I think that's such an exciting trend. I call folks like you applied meta scientists, right? Like I think you guys building this scientific infrastructure that, there's going to be big companies built, but I also think you guys are speeding up discovery in a really profound way. And I'm really cheering it on. The question though is about that barrier. And the question is, will you go back to doing research ever? And what is the future of that boundary? Is it permeable, or is it always going to be this kind of one-way street of a steady leakage of scientists becoming entrepreneurs? What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's permeable. And I think there's, for me, it's like, it's kind of in many ways weird, right? Because I went from being a cancer biologist to really like a software entrepreneur in a lot of ways. And I mean, that's really what Science Exchange is predominantly a software company. But I still have, my heart is definitely in the science, right? Like I still read all of the scientific journals. I mentor a lot of science companies, so a lot of biotechs, and I'm working closely with like a new company called Rearbase that I'm super excited about, that leverages Science Exchange to outsource their work and enable sort of a biotech approach for drug discovery for ultra rare diseases, where there's really, no traditional biotech or pharma will apply that sort of process. So they've historically, kind of been lumped into this world where they could only kind of fund academic grants instead of really being able to get at drug discovery for their disease. So like there's a lot of things that I try to still stay involved with from the science side. And I think what's really cool about Science Exchange and being the CEO of Science Exchange is I actually get to see all the best practices of all of these companies that we work with. I mean, we work with most of the large pharmaceutical companies, and many biotechs. And I think getting to see what they're doing and how they're doing their drug discovery and all of the latest technologies. So if you're working in a biotech whose core technology is gene therapy, like we're getting to see how they develop those drugs. Same thing for, small molecules, for antibodies, for cell-based therapies, siRNA, ASOs, like we get to kind of see that. And it's actually really, really cool to kind of have that overview of the industry and then be able to think about how to apply that to these very small ultra rare indications where, like I said, you wouldn't actually get to do that historically.
That's cool. All right. Well,
yeah. And so I guess to your question about permeability, I see, a lot of people now, it's almost, as a scientist in the biomedical world, like everyone's sort of going into biotech, and I definitely think that it's permeable. People can go back into academia, and I think there's a lot of focus on that translation side. So there's a lot of interest in academia recruiting back people who've done translation of discoveries into actual therapies. But I think the challenge comes down to like, can you actually recruit those people back? Because from an economic perspective, biotech is extremely lucrative. So it's hard to kind of compete with that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'm excited to see how it plays out. I think, so the things we've been talking about this, the ways that the university is being unbundled.
Yeah.
Is I think it's going to drive more permeability to that line. And I think I just think I'm so excited to see what folks like you do, not just from building company perspective, but from the the ways that you decide to come back and contribute to the scientific process. And the reproducibility project is a great example. But we'll see what happens. I'm excited.
I think when I started, I knew the problem we were solving was the bureaucracy. So like I felt like as a scientist, I didn't want to, spend time on, wondering whether there was a contract or chasing up my contracts department. And I certainly didn't want to set up each individual partner I worked with as a supplier in my Ariba system and then, then have to troubleshoot that piece. But I don't think I realized like the scale and how much that would grow. So like Science Exchange also, experienced, I think luck in the sense that I think we knew this would happen, but the industry really, massively adopted outsourcing. So there's been, an exponential growth and the amount of dollars in terms of R&D dollars that are spent outside organizations at CROs, and the complexity of those relationships. So have it like each pharma company will work with 1,000 plus CROs and CMOs each year to do the R&D. So you can imagine if they're having to set each of them up, make sure they have a contract in place, manage all of these random invoices, manage the projects with them, data exchange, all the IT security. I mean, that is a real nightmare. So with Science Exchange doing all that process once, they essentially have a window, a software platform where they know all the compliance is in place, all the contracts in place, there's project management for the scientists, they can exchange that large data files. Like there's a lot of value there.
Oh, yeah. So when I saw that project management page that you showed at the end, it was like, it's really clear just how much this platform is giving scientists superpowers. And
Yep.
it makes me wonder if scientists even realize that they have these kind of powers yet. Like there's all these tools and platforms that are emerging, and yours is really probably still the best example. Musicians like figured out that, getting a big record deal wasn't going to be the way that they created a career. And I don't think scientists have really pieced together this alternate kind of, I don't know what to call it, right? Like this alternate career path almost, where they realize like all of a sudden the tools that they have are very different than they were 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I would just touch on that a little bit, where I think sometimes to me it's, the value that where all the value creation comes from, like what's the most important job role in any of these pharma or biotech companies or in academia. It's the person doing the R&D. Like that's actually the innovation engine for the company. It's the most important component. And sometimes it's almost like people lose sight of that. And, I sometimes have questions where it's like, literally the head of R&D or the CSO of a biotech or, the head of R&D at a pharma company will sort of be like, yes, I want this. This is, obvious that my scientists have to have this. And then there's all of these roadblocks to them, like, the administrative side of the organization doesn't want to do it. And I'm like, well, aren't they there to support you? Like you're the ones that are actually generating all the value. Like you're actually doing the discovery and making the products. And so that kind of almost blows my mind. And I think that's where, when you're an entrepreneur, you kind of get used to like the idea that you can break all these rules and you can like make the world the way you want it to be. And that's something that big companies, I think, really struggle with. And that's why there's this mass exodus where people the scientists, the most brilliant scientists who are working in these big companies where there's so much bureaucracy and administration, they can't do their science, they're leaving. They're going to biotech so they can have that same experience of I can actually just do what I want to do. I can actually get the science done and not sort of jump through all these hoops and like follow all these rules. And that's really exciting because it's resulted in this explosion in innovation and in new therapeutics that are coming to market.
Very exciting. Okay, so the last question I ask everyone, and what are your, given everything you've learned, what are your best ideas for making, continuing to make science better?
Wow, that is kind of a hard question. I think science has become so much better than when I started Science Exchange. So that's like the first thing that I think is actually, like, when you look back, I think, wow, it really has evolved in this really great way. Like, there's so many things to be kind of really positive about, and in terms of improvements to science. And a lot of them are around, all of these sort of conversions of things that I don't know they were necessarily planned, but they came together in a way that's really positive. So I think the rise in outsourcing is super positive from a quality perspective, from an efficiency perspective. Those things are really positive. And I think that industrialization, the use of robots, automation, as much as possible, super positive. And I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in terms of how we value or evaluate scientists. So that's something that I think potentially your work could be very transformative in. We were talking before the interview started about distribution of grant funding and how funding is allocated. I would take that. I would also extend that into distribution of funding from an entrepreneurial perspective. I think the biotech industry struggles a lot from kind of we only look at the people who have already done this before, and they have to be, already super famous for us to want to, work with them. And I think that's a huge mistake. Like, the tech world has shown that, there's a lot of brilliant people out there, and we want to distribute that funding. When I see these huge, funding rounds of $800 million for a single company, it kind of just makes me, if you distribute that across, a bunch of companies, that, you just have so much more chance of having great shots on goal. That side of the world I would like to see open up a lot more. And it's hard because there's a lot of proxies that people use for quality in science, which we know, which don't necessarily reflect actual quality. But I hope that that will be an area where we see innovation in terms of people taking more risks, working with unproven people who are really talented that could create great companies.
Sounds great. I love that. I love that vision. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'm continuing to follow along, and am excited to see where Science Exchange goes in the next decade.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.